turned over a bright metal shell that rippled when
She says human longing for mystery leads to a commonality of belief in immortality.
Dad's late or I'm early. Either way, I have time to scout the pens. Kim's
Redemption and claustrophobia, what artists understand. Not valuing the
I was born and grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, but I've been living in Nebraska for about 10 years, in Omaha until recently. Right now, my wife and I are in the process of moving up to Hartington in the northeast corner of the state. I've just started work as managing editor of Nebraska Life magazine. And so that's what I do. Before that, I've done a lot of different things. Used to work as a counselor in a psychiatric hospital, worked most recently for a small telecommunications company. So I'm really liking being an editor. It's a lot closer to who I am. It was 1992, and I came to Nebraska originally to work at Richard Young in Omaha, the psychiatric hospital. Was just out of school, and had basically just been going through the phone books of the region, looking for places that might be hiring, and I called the place. You know, I really hadn't set out to come to Omaha or to become a Nebraskan. It just kind of happened that way, and now I'm married into a diehard Husker family. You know, I wear the Husker shirts that I get for Christmas and cheer for the team, and now I'm managing editor of Nebraska Life, so I guess I'm a convert. Growing up in Iowa and living here, it's like you're constantly reminded from the mainstream media that you live in a part of the country that's considered unimportant or is considered obscure or considered backward, considered a lot of different things, a lot of misconceptions, a lot of people who don't know where you're from. You know, I live in Nebraska. Oh, what state is that in? There are people in parts of the country who really don't know. And to me, it's a challenge in a positive way. It's a challenge to find and tell those stories about those places that are kind of overlooked. That was kind of the idea behind the Dirty Wicked Town book, to delve into the past of Omaha, this tame, Midwestern, boring town as people think. I hadn't really thought about the influence of family members on my writing too much, because I thought, well, you know, there just aren't any other writers in my immediate family. Although some years ago I discovered a letter that my grandfather wrote in 1935. I never knew my grandfather. He died before I was born. But it's funny. It's a hilarious, smart-alecky letter that he wrote to his sister-in-law, inviting her to stay at their house so that she could, and then he lists all these different chores and things that she could do because he doesn't have much time, because the ball games are being broadcast on the radio and so forth. And you know, I read that and I thought, oh, maybe part of that is genetic. I don't know. My wife, more recently, has pointed out, she said, you know, your mom likes to tell stories. And when she tells a story, she doesn't get right to the punchline. She won't tell you the important part right up front. She'll kind of build the suspense a little bit. She said, and you do that too. As far as other influences, the writers, I would say, that have influenced me the most, Mark Twain has been a big influence. I love his humor. I also like the idea that he can be very incisive with his humor. Can write angrily. You know, there can be an agenda there. It's fun, and yet sometimes it isn't always just fun. It can be quite serious. Theodore Dostoevsky, these dark psychological stories. I don't really write like him, but I know he's been. When I was a teenager and started reading his stuff, that was very influential. It opened a lot of doors, a lot of ideas for me. More recently, John Steinbeck, though I have to admit that I never read The Grapes of Wrath until a few years ago, and now I think it's one of the finest novels I've ever read. And certainly, I'm thinking about this more since the Lord of the Rings movie, first movie came out. J.R.R. Tolkien, when I was in my early teens, was very, very important, just a brilliant storyteller. And for me, that's the measure. If you can tell a story, you know, you've got to, if you want to preach to the reader, if you want to educate the reader, all that stuff is fine, but you've got to tell a story first. You've got to earn the right to be heard. I usually say that I started writing when I was 16, because that's really when I got serious about it. It goes back farther than that. I don't remember this, but I guess I wrote some essay when I was in second grade, and my teacher told my mom, he's going to be a writer. And when I was 12, I wrote an editorial for our junior high school paper. And it was sent to a relative of mine in Oklahoma, and it appeared in the Anadarko Daily News, this small town newspaper. And so that's actually my first real publication when I was just 12. But when I was 16, I had thought about wanting to write, you know, for years. And when I was 16, I just really started doing it. I started working on some stories. I finished a short novel about the time that I graduated from high school. It was never published, for good reason, but I learned a lot about writing then. And ever since that time, I've always been in that mindset that even if I'm not working on a story now, I'm thinking about wanting to write something. Younger, I remember being in my early teens, and I was really into Tolkien at that time. And then I watched the movie that came out and realized, yeah, I think I still am. Although I don't write fantasy, but at that time I had some ideas for some stories like that, and I planned them all out. But before I got things really fully planned, I had kind of lost interest and then moved on to something else, and so I didn't really get anything written. Finally, I decided about the time that I turned 16 just to start writing and go from there. And that's kind of how it's been since then. When I was in college, I really didn't have much time to do my own writing. It was all classroom-related stuff. And through the years, you know, there have been times when it's like, I want to write, but I don't know what to write about. And once I got out of college and I got out on my own, it was like that problem kind of solved itself. I started reading a lot of stuff that I'd never read before, and I just started getting a little better idea, a little clearer idea of what kind of stories that I need to be writing. And so, of course, I've been much more productive since then. It's hard to describe, but it's like sometimes I will be, you know, reading some nonfiction stuff or just reading something, and I end up telling my wife about it, and she's very patient. It's a good thing. And I'll end up talking, you know, for an hour or more about something, and maybe it's something that I've never read about before or heard about before, and you know, I kind of realize that if I like talking about it, if I'm really that attracted to that material, you know, maybe that's a story for me to write. Quite often, in recent years, it's been historical. I kind of discovered history after I got out of school. And quite often it's been regional, it's been local stuff, because I've been living in Omaha, and so I've had access to the obscure stuff, the primary source stuff. And so I've really been focusing on that. And I don't know how that'll change through the years. I think the love of history is there to stay. I love the perspective that it gives you on your own time. And so quite often the stories that I want to tell have something to do with the past. When I'm talking to my wife, I mean, I'm telling the story.
Yes.
Or I will find myself, if I'm interested in something, even without really thinking about it, I'm kind of writing a story in my mind. I'm thinking about how I would write about it. It just, I guess over the years, even really before I started writing seriously, I guess I've always done that. I've always thought in narrative terms, and I've always thought about how I would say it. Because if you say it just right, it's so much better. I can add to that, quite often I'm attracted to stories of injustice. I don't do a lot of that, but if something makes me angry, I want to write about it. Or I guess if something, concerns me, if I feel like it's important, it's kind of hard to say. Sometimes you don't always know why something attracts you, but it's just some stories demand to be told, and others don't, and others sit there for a while, and then they get your attention. In many ways, it's kind of hard to put a finger on exactly what that is. I'm really not a morning person. Usually, my best times of writing are in the evening. I think a lot of that has just been due to my work schedule. During my adult life, if I'm writing, I'm either doing it in the evening after work or on the weekend. And I am rarely, if ever, productive in the morning. Although I guess I can be if I have time to get warmed up. For me, that's the main thing, is I have to have some time to get warmed up and get into it. I can't just sit down for 10 minutes and write. I've got to have time to get into the mindset. And then I can go for a few hours. And then I need a little break, and then I can go for a few hours more. But it's like, once you're kind of in the zone, time can pass very quickly. You just have to sit down and start writing, and it's very difficult to get going, or to get anything on paper that's worthwhile. But it's like it gets easier and easier. Sometimes it's like you just have to start doing it, and then the inspiration will come. You can't wait for the inspiration. You have to work, and then, at least that's how it is with me. Sometimes if I'm trying to write and it's not happening, it means I haven't done my homework. I haven't done enough research. And sometimes I realize I'm trying to describe something, but I don't really know what it's like. And if it's historical, it means I need to read more. Or if it's an interview, someone I've talked with, maybe I need to call them back and ask a few more questions. Sometimes just making one little change will make the difference. I usually compose at the keyboard on my computer. But sometimes, for whatever reason, it helps me to write longhand. Turn off the computer and just write longhand. And I think because when I'm typing, when I'm writing on the computer, I'm editing as I go. I write a little bit, I go back, I fix it, and it's kind of this back and forth motion. And so by the time I'm done with something, it's reasonably polished. When I write longhand, I can't edit much because it's just too much of a mess. And sometimes that's what you need to do, is to just go and not edit yourself. Don't worry about spelling, don't worry about any of that stuff, and just go with it. And sometimes that's the very thing that will get me unstuck and get me rolling. I think I do have a definite style. I guess it's hard for me to say exactly what that is. I know that as a young writer, I don't know if I ever consciously imitated another writer. I kind of did, but a lot of my early stuff, you could tell, when I was into Jack London, I was writing that kind of stuff. C.S. Lewis, and some of the other people I've mentioned. I remember when I was in 8th grade, I read Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington. I had read Roots by Alex Haley a year earlier, and so when I saw Up From Slavery, I had no idea who Washington was. I'd never heard of W.B. Du Bois at that time. And I started reading this book, and I started writing like him, which was kind of a bad thing because Washington's style is very, very stuffy, very formal, and fortunately I got over that in a hurry. And I think it was just kind of the accumulation of being influenced by this writer and then that writer and some other writer. And for a while I was trying to write short sentences, keep it very simple. And I guess that just wasn't me, because I tend to write longer sentences. Sometimes they get a little too sprawling and I have to edit them and cut them down. So I don't know if I can say exactly what my style is, but I guess it's an accumulation of everyone that I've read and loved, and whatever it is that's unique about me. I write for Danette, my wife, and if she doesn't like it, it doesn't work. I don't always agree with that. You know, there are times when I've read her something and she'll say, I don't know. Oh, but this is good. This is good. And I don't agree with her. More often than not, I end up later going back and realizing, she was right. I got to fix that. It's too over the top, or it's too whatever. So I usually read something aloud. If I finish a chapter or a story, I read it aloud to her. And sometimes I can tell if I'm reading it aloud, if the language is cumbersome. If she's giving me one of these confused looks, then I know I'm not being clear. And so my idealized reader is a general reader. If I'm writing history, my idealized reader is not necessarily a history buff. It's someone who just likes a good story, who doesn't necessarily like history and who may think that they don't like history. My kind of reader is, they like a good story, they like something to be, kind of smart and thought-provoking, but not needlessly difficult. They've got a fairly good vocabulary, but, not much tolerance of needless show-off language. They want to be entertained, but they will also, want something that has some meat to it. And with just about anything that I write, that's the sort of person that I'm writing for. And my wife, Danette, is that kind of reader. Mostly, I like to think that I, do more than that, that a good story gives you some sort of window into the human condition, into human nature, tells you, it's sort of like the filmmaker Ken Burns. When he talks about his documentary films, quite often he'll use the phrase, something about trying to discover who we are as a people. And he's kind of talking about Americans, who we are as Americans, but also kind of who we are as humans. And I like that idea, like the Dirty Wicked Town book. It's a collection of Omaha stories. It isn't written just for Omaha. It isn't necessarily just about Omaha. It's about people and how people build a town, how people interact, how people have changed through the years and how they haven't changed through the years. So usually my stuff comes down to that sort of thing, that whatever that human quality is, who we are, good and bad, patience and persistence and revision. I just wrote an article not too long ago about Beth Streeter Aldrich, and I had read an essay of hers. I think it was How I Mix Stories with Donuts or something, and she's talking about being a mother and a wife and running a household and writing her stories. And she talks about hearing from writers who have received 3 rejection letters, and they're all discouraged, and what should they do? It was quite funny how she got kind of worked up about that. Oh, come on. And that's the thing. If you want to write and you want other people to read your work, you've got to be very persistent, because there are very few writers, if any, out there who haven't received a ton of rejection letters. Sometimes for stuff that just wasn't any good, that needed work. Sometimes for stuff that was brilliant. That's part of the game. You have to be persistent. You have to be willing to revise, because sometimes the difference between a good story and one that just doesn't work is that last revision. you have to be willing to do your homework. In the early days, I tried to just write from what I already knew and was not very successful at it. Quite often you have to read a lot of books, talk to a lot of people, go to a lot of places before you really have the material. And that's true even if you're writing fiction. And you have to keep the reader in mind. I guess there's sort of like, there's two poles or two extremes. One is writing is a business. Your reader is your customer. You are trying to sell them a product. You give the reader exactly what they want. You have a focus group. It's marketing. I don't know. And of course, that I do not like that attitude. The other extreme is writing is art. You should write for yourself and not care a thing in the world about what anyone else thinks. Be true to your own artistic vision. On the one hand, if you're trying to be too commercial, you're going to write crap. You're going to write stuff that maybe it'll sell, but probably it won't. And it's not going to be original. It's not going to have any of you in it. If you go to the other extreme, you're writing for yourself. It's unlikely, at least for me, it would probably just be too self-indulgent. And I think perhaps the best approach is maybe for the first draft, write for yourself. Tell the story that you want to tell the way you want to tell it. But when you revise, at least by the time you're ready to send the thing out into the world, take the reader into consideration and consider whether the type of person that you're writing for, your idealized reader, is going to be bored by it, whether they're going to understand what you're talking about. Otherwise, you're just writing a diary. Most of what I've written has been nonfiction. Now that I'm working for Nebraska Life magazine, again, it's mostly a nonfiction thing. I think of myself basically as a storyteller. Now, that doesn't mean that if I'm writing nonfiction, I get to take liberties with the facts, but you have to arrange the facts in such a way that it makes a good narrative that someone is going to read. But fiction has always been an interest of mine, and I'm wanting to do more of it in the future. A Dirty Wicked Town was my first book, or the first to be published, rather. It's nonfiction, but written so that it reads, like a collection of short stories, even though it's factual and it's footnoted. And I didn't. There aren't any stretchers in there, as Mark Twain might say. Yeah. But fiction, and particularly the novel, I'm really not much of a short story writer, at least not so far. I've done a few of them. I'm in the process of revising a novel that's partly based on some of the Omaha history material. It's set in Omaha in the 1870s. And my goal is to do more fiction, to continue to do that. I don't know if it will all be historical. This story happens to be. Probably a lot of it will be in one way or another. But certainly I think I'll always do both fiction and nonfiction. I'm attracted to both for different reasons. But if I had to only do one thing, I would probably choose the novel at this point, although maybe not, because the novel isn't really paying anything right yet, and whereas working for Nebraska Life is a steady job. That's the novel that I just mentioned is the main current project. I've got ideas for other novels. There is a novel that I wrote prior to the Dirty Wicked Town book that I sought a publisher for, was not successful, and now that I've got some distance on the thing, I can see how I want to change it. I want to do a rewrite of it, and that one is set in mostly in territorial Kansas in the 1850s. I was attracted to that material because I had started reading about the radical abolitionist John Brown, and I see some parallels between that type of person and some people who are around today, and the idea of someone using violence that they think is serving the right or serving God And so that's certainly a story that still attracts me, and I want to go back to that. I've got lots of ideas, and I don't know which ones I'll get to. But for the time being, this Omaha novel is kind of in the forefront of my mind. I just envisioned the book. Okay, the book is on the bookstore shelves. I didn't know if I was going to get any publicity for the thing or not. And so I thought of the title and the cover together. The cover was designed by the publisher, but I made a number of suggestions. And the idea is I wanted something that was a little outrageous. It was kind of over the top, that would get someone's attention and make them want to pick up the book. And so I'd been thinking, a mean, rotten, dirty, low down, what can I come up with? And so a dirty, wicked town seemed to work. And I suggested to the publisher, put the word wicked and the word Omaha in red. That'll get them. The two chapters that I've selected are both from the middle section of the book. A Dirty, Wicked Town it's not a comprehensive history, it's a collection of true stories that are arranged in chronological order, so you get a sense of development. And these two stories are from the middle section of the book. The first one is titled Mr. Rosewater and the Great Balloon, and it is about the first balloon flights in Nebraska that took place in the 1870s. Mr. Rosewater was Ed Rosewater, publisher and editor of the Omaha Bee, one of the early day newspapers. And he was quite a fiery, hot-tempered editor, fit many of the editorial stereotypes. At one time in his life, cowhided a rival editor on the street of Omaha. That's another chapter in the book. The fun thing about that particular chapter, in a way, it's one of my favorites. I think it's my favorite fun chapter in the book. There are some others that are a little more dark. And it's my favorite, and I'm incorporating it into the novel that I'm writing. I like it partly because it's a good story, partly because it was an accident. I'd never heard of it before. I was looking for something completely different, and I saw a drawing of a balloon in the pages of the Omaha Bee, and I started reading, and I realized, well, they're promoting a balloon flight for their 4th of July celebration in 1875. Well, that was 25 years before any other balloon flight that I had heard of in Nebraska. And it ended up being this wonderful story, just a real comedy of errors. So that's the first one. The second one is called The Bridge, and it is set during the years 1868 to 1873, I believe, roughly around the same time. And it's the story of the first bridge to span the Missouri River, a railroad bridge built by the Union Pacific Railroad. And particularly, partly it's about some of the shenanigans that were involved in getting the thing built, because bribery and political corruption and all that sort of stuff is always a good story. But partly it's the story of kind of a remarkable rescue. The bridge was partly destroyed by a tornado, and the night watchman on the Council Bluffs side had to cross the river in order to stop the train that was about to depart from the Union Depot in Omaha. And of course it's still dark while he's doing this, it's still storming, and maybe the train would have seen that the bridge was out. Maybe they wouldn't have. So anyway, it was a story that was a lot of fun. It was a story of some courage and heroism. And it was one of those that when I heard about it, it was one of those stories that grabbed me, and I knew I had to tell that story. And so I felt like the two of those might give people a nice taste of what the book is about.
Or to enjoy the Heritage Room as a reading room where anyone who is interested can come in and read from our collection. Our reader tonight is David Bristow, author of A Dirty Wicked Town, Tales of 19th Century Omaha. Bristow has lived in Nebraska since 1992 and is managing editor of Nebraska Life magazine. I was interested to find that in the current issue there is an insightful interview article by David Bristow on state poet Bill Clefcorn, with selected poems and some of Clefcorn's thoughts about poetry. Somewhere in the article, Bristow comments about Clefcorn's poetry as follows: like a good story, a good poem deals in specifics, not in airy generalities, but its details are rooted in something universal in human experience. Which brings us to tonight's reading. A Dirty Wicked Town is history written especially as story, and the main thing that the author asks of his audience is that they like a good story. And that's what you will be hearing tonight. May I introduce to you David Bristow.
Thank you very much. I'll be reading 2 chapters from the book. The book is a collection of true stories from 1854 through the turn of the century. And both of these are kind of toward the middle of the book. And the first one is called Mr. Rosewater and the Great Balloon. Mr. Rosewater is Ed Rosewater, publisher and editor of the Omaha Bee, one of the old-time Omaha newspapers. One of the fun things that one of the things that was a lot of fun when I was researching this was just reading the old newspapers, because they were so wonderfully hateful toward one another. Some great rivalries and a lot of really colorful writing. And of course that rivalry comes into this first selection. And I'll tell you about the second one when we get there. John Steiner may have been a reckless fool, but he was also a painstakingly well-prepared fool. His preparedness was shown by his rigid examination of every cord, knot, and fiber of his hydrogen-filled balloon. His foolishness was shown by his intention to go up in the thing at all. 10,000 people, by the Bee's enthusiastic estimate, waited anxiously to see if he could do it. It was the 4th of July, 1872, and the professor was performing his fussy pre-flight inspection before the largest crowd Omaha had ever seen. At 11th and Farnham, and I'm quoting, "All the windows were filled, the roofs of all the buildings for blocks around were covered, the streets were jammed with pedestrians and persons and carriages, all anxiously waiting to witness the ascension." Slowly, the snow-white balloon took shape. Inflated, it would stand 70 feet tall and hold 20,000 cubic feet of gas. Everyone in the crowd had heard of the great manned balloons, but few, if any, had ever seen one. From time to time, as the ascension drew nearer, the crowd broke into spontaneous cheering. Flight was a mysterious and wonderful thing. It had started in France in 1783. As with the early space flights of the 20th century, animals were sent aloft first, and for the same reason, to see if they could survive in the strange environment. The first hydrogen balloon was also tested that year. When the unmanned balloon landed several miles outside Paris, terrified peasants attacked it with pitchforks, killed it, and dragged it triumphantly through the streets of their village. Fortunately for the human aeronauts who were to follow, the King of France soon issued a proclamation assuring everyone that, despite rumors to the contrary, balloons were not man-eating monsters. Nearly 90 years had passed since those pioneer flights, and no one was going to mistake Steiner's balloon for a monster. Neither would they mistake Steiner for a completely sane man. A German by birth, he had come to America in the 1850s, and within a few years had earned a national reputation as an aeronaut of exceptional daring. His 1857 attempt to fly across Lake Erie is the stuff of legend. Floating placidly among brewing thunderclouds, Steiner nearly reached the Canadian shore before the wind shifted and blew him back out over the lake. Desperate, he descended toward a passing ship far below. He missed his mark by 3 miles. Splashing down into the white-capped water, the partly deflated balloon was dragged along by the wind, bouncing its way toward the ship. When it drew near, Steiner leapt overboard and swam to safety. During the next several years, Steiner won a balloon race against another famous aeronaut, flew observation balloons for the Union Army during the Civil War, and gave exhibitions and passenger flights in various cities. He was also a balloon builder. The craft he proposed to fly in Omaha was his own design and had been constructed under his supervision. Not that his balloon was particularly original. In many ways, balloons had changed very little over the years. The main part of a gas balloon was, of course, the fabric envelope, the balloon itself. At the top of the envelope was a valve to let out gas in order to descend. Near the valve was a rip panel, a portion of the fabric that could be torn open if the valve stuck. Both valve and rip panel were operated by ropes that ran down inside the balloon to the basket below. On the outside, the envelope was covered with netting, which was tied to a suspension hoop, a large ring from which hung the wicker basket in which the aeronaut would ride. A typical basket was equipped with a mat board, an instrument box, a drag rope for someone on the ground to catch hold of during a landing, and a number of sandbags. The balloon was piloted by dropping sandbags in order to rise and by pulling the valve rope in order to descend. For guidance, most aeronauts carried map, compass, and a barometer metered to show the altitude. Beyond that, they went wherever the wind carried them. 15 men held the balloon down as Steiner climbed aboard at 7 o'clock. "Let her go," he said. At once the balloon, quote, shot upwards amid the deafening cheers and waving of hands, hats, and handkerchiefs of the assembled thousands. The professor boldly stood upon the edge of the frail-looking basket, grasping hold of the rigging above and waving his hand in answer to the unbounded enthusiasm below. For the next half hour, the crowd watched spellbound as the balloon soared ever higher and ever farther south in the yellow light of the setting sun. And then they could see it no more, and could only wonder where the professor was now and what he was experiencing. From an altitude of 12,000 feet, a little more than 2 miles above the Missouri Valley floor, Steiner gazed out over the endless expanse of prairie that lay below him. He breathed deeply in the thin air, and his breath was as frosty as on a winter's day. The thermometer read 31 degrees. Steiner was wearing his overcoat. His ears hurt with the cold. But it was a good flight, as the bee described it. He looked with delight upon the enthusiastic assemblage below, and took in the magnificent proportions of Omaha with the naked eye, while he was obliged to discover the whereabouts of the insignificant village of Council Bluffs by means of a telescope. He saw the Missouri for over 50 miles each way, and came to the conclusion that it was more crooked than the ways of the evildoer. He traced the Platte for a distance of about 65 miles. As the sun shone on it, it resembled a streak of silver. He landed about 15 minutes after sunset, having been in the air about an hour and a quarter. He struck in a swamp 15 miles south of Council Bluffs and near the Kansas City, St. Joe, and Council Bluffs Railroad. Found by a wide-eyed local man, Steiner and balloon were soon aboard a farm wagon and on their way back to Omaha. Next morning, Steiner had the satisfaction of strolling into the Metropolitan Hotel to tell his story to a surprised and admiring audience. Soon, the professor went his way to other cities and other flights. But in Omaha, a seed of an idea had been planted. It would spring to life 3 years later. Gold was the watchword of the mid-1870s. In the midst of a severe economic depression, rumors of gold in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory could hardly have been more strategically timed. When an 1874 military expedition led by George Armstrong Custer confirmed the rumors, the rush was on. Who cared if the Black Hills had been guaranteed to the Sioux by a treaty? Who cared that the Sioux, or Lakota, had earned a reputation as the hardest fighting natives of the plains, and that such an invasion of their sacred hills was likely to start a war? The mighty Custer didn't care, though he would in due time. At the Omaha Bee, Ed Rosewater followed the news of the gold rush with keen interest. Ever ambitious, he wanted to send a reporter to the Black Hills, and wanted, in doing so, to draw as much attention as possible to the Bee. Just 4 years after the Bee's founding, Rosewater was already promoting it as the leading newspaper in the West, and he was willing to consider any idea that would enhance its prestige. Strange opportunities can come to those who are watching for them. In June 1875, Rosewater learned that no one in Omaha was planning a citywide 4th of July celebration for the nation's 99th birthday. Further, he learned of the availability for purchase of a large gas balloon. Suddenly, the fiery editor's ambitions converged into a single outrageous scheme. Readers of the Bee could not have missed the announcement that appeared in the June 21, 1875 issue, under the heading 1776, 1875. An engraving of a balloon was displayed proudly over the words, "The 4th of July." What the Bee was proposing was a grand Independence Day celebration featuring a balloon ascension. But that was only the beginning. The ascension, to take place at the fairgrounds, would be nothing less than the departure of an aerial expedition to the Black Hills, a flight of 450 miles west-northwest to the gold fields of Harney Peak. The balloonist, Ranger John H. Pierce, a former tightrope walker, would be accompanied by his wife and by Andrew Rosewater, the brother of Ed, of the Bee. The Bee spared no expense and made sure that its readers appreciated the magnitude of the undertaking. In the weeks following the announcement, the Bee boasted of the great expense of the Bee balloon and of the veritable circus that would surround its departure. Indeed, the numbers were impressive: 5,000 pounds of iron, 18,000 pounds of water plus sulfuric acid and a large battery, just to manufacture enough hydrogen to fill the balloon. 30,000 handbills distributed among various railroads, 5,000 postcard invitations mailed to every part of the state, plus mammoth red, white, and blue posters, and several small balloons in which to send up live animals such as hogs, cats, dogs, etc. There would be music from 1, maybe 2 full bands, plus dancing, horse races, foot races, sack races, a greased pole climb, a greased pig, a baseball match, a fine picnic, and fireworks. In short, it was going to be the grandest thing Omaha had ever seen, and it was being put on solely by the Bee. If any of this impressed Republican editor, Major St. Ambrose Durant Balcom, he was careful not to show it. In fact, he soon had the dirt on the Bee balloon and gleefully spread it all over the June 22nd issue of the Republican. The balloon, the Republican claimed, had been moldering in a local warehouse for 3 years before it was bought cheaply by the Bee. It was none other than Steiner's balloon from '72, which the professor had left with a local merchant as payment for a debt. Said the Republican, "The Bee's large balloon at a great expense has been in soak so long that it will probably be as rotten as the concern that sends it to the Black Hills." Rosewater, of course, responded in kind. "No one except the Republican has attempted to throw cold water on the celebration. The spite of that decaying sheet is easily accounted for by the fact that it cannot bear to see anything succeed that is undertaken by the Bee. Its venomous malice does not hurt the Bee balloon in the least, but reflects upon its own head and shows to the public the selfish nature which controls its every action." On July 3rd, the day of the planned ascension, the 4th itself fell on a Sunday that year, the Republican stated its case in more detail. Citing an unnamed source, it claimed that Rosewater had paid all of $7.50 for Steiner's old balloon, which had been stored in a warehouse on the bottoms and has been accessible to the rats and the vermin that are peculiar to warehouses. "An aerial voyage in a new and stout balloon is a perilous undertaking," the Republican warned, "but it is as near suicide as it can be for a man to attempt to start skyward in an old and rotten balloon as this one is." However spiteful these charges were, they appear to have had substance. As the Bee later admitted, the balloon needed repairs before its flight date. Its netting was not strong enough for an extended trip, and its basket was in poor condition. The Bee boasted that it had purchased a Steiner balloon. Did Rosewater expect anyone to believe that a new balloon built by the meticulous professor would have such defects? And was he really going to send his own brother up in such a decrepit contraption? When will the balloon start? Was the question on everyone's lips. The 3rd of July was growing old, and a crowd of 2,000 to 3,000 people milled impatiently about the fairgrounds. The music and games and picnic had gone well enough, but these had been merely the sideshow. The main event that everyone had come to see, had paid admission to see, was a balloon launch. But even as its shadow grew long in the late afternoon sun, the bee balloon still hung from a pole in a shapeless mass. Pierce and both of the Rosewater brothers were scurrying about, working like Turks, but their iron and sulfuric acid brew was not making hydrogen quickly enough to fill the envelope. Things started to get ugly. So they pressed up around the balloon, reported the Republican next day, and one man offered $10 that the balloon wouldn't rise 10 feet from the ground. He was accused of working in the interest of this paper in talking down the balloon, but the sympathies of the crowd were with him, and Pierce got out his 2 pops and held the crowd at bay at the muzzle of his revolvers. By nightfall, even Pierce and the Rosewater brothers admitted it was hopeless. Promising a launch next day, they arranged for the balloon to be taken by wagon down to Jefferson Square, a city park near a gas main. Though earlier issues of the Bee had ridiculed the use of coal gas as an amateur's way of ballooning, right now it didn't look like such a bad idea. But there was no launch the next day, or the day after that, or the day after that. The Bee balloon refused to become buoyant enough to rise. Among Omahans, impatience and disappointment began turning to scorn and ridicule. Consider the Republicans' report of the events of July 4th. Pierce had a small circus of his own on Jefferson Square on Sunday with the balloon. About 200 small boys gathered around Pierce and the balloon, and they advised him to go home to sell his balloon, and they gave him a great quantity of advice that they considered sound. They also entrusted him with hundreds of messages to their friends in the Black Hills to be delivered when he arrived there. The sarcasm and sharp wit of the boys goaded Pierce to a frenzy. He went raving mad and torn around the premises, charging the boys back and making just such fun as the boys wanted. He declared that he hadn't had any sleep or food for 2 days on account of that balloon, and he really didn't believe that the boys appreciated the balloon anyway. Day by day, the failures mounted. By July 8th, a taunting Republican headline proclaimed fraud, fizzle, failure, and gleefully detailed each of the 6 failed attempts to send the balloon skyward. The 7th, the Republican noted, was to take place that morning, in case anyone was foolish enough to want to go out and watch it. An aerial elephant on Rosewater's hands, noted part of the headline, and it was the truth. Instead of launching a balloon, Edward Rosewater had launched the worst public relations disaster in the Bee's short history. No one had said that the 7th attempt would be the last, but you had to wonder how long it could go on. The gas was hooked up at 4 a.m., an hour before sunrise. By 6, when much of Omaha was still in bed, a small gathering looked on as the basket was attached, and Pierce gave the word to let her go. He stood alone in the basket, the idea of 3 passengers having been abandoned days earlier. The men let go, but the balloon would not rise. It was filled full, as much as it could hold without bursting, but still it would not rise. But even then, Pierce was not beaten. Ordering the basket untied, he climbed up into the balloon's netting, sat on the suspension hoop, and held onto the ropes. And with a boost from the onlookers, the balloon slowly began to rise. And so, at the very time the Republicans' newsboys were hitting the streets with the fraud, fizzle, failure issue, a small crowd at Jefferson Square was cheering the madman hanging in the netting of a large white balloon as it floated serenely over the city. Pierce was heading north, soon leaving Omaha behind. There was no hope of the Black Hills now, not without a basket. He was flying for pride now, out of sheer, mad determination, flying with a tenacity that a man like Ed Rosewater could surely appreciate. After a slow start, he rose steadily into the sky, topping out somewhere between a quarter and a half mile up. He could see the Omaha and Northwestern Railroad track below, the town of Florence up ahead, and the Missouri River to his right. The wind began carrying him a little to the east, out over the wide Missouri. On the other side of the river, 15 miles of swamps and sloughs lay between him and the Luss Hills of Iowa. Pierce realized that he had forgotten his life preserver, and at this time he wished for it more than any other thing in the world. There was only one thing to do now, and that was to try to get back down quickly and on dry land. The river twisted this way and that, and Florence, Nebraska, lay about a mile ahead. Opening up the gas valve, Pierce began descending toward it. Seeing a farmer below, Pierce called out for help. He meant, of course, that he would need help with the balloon once he landed, but the farmer, a German immigrant, did not understand this. "What in hell's the matter, anyhow?" the farmer shouted back. "You takes me for a tam fool, as I can nick do nothings mit you up there." By now the balloon was slowly collapsing above Pierce, toppling over on one side owing to the escape of the gas and the inrushing air. He was coming down all right, but he was headed straight toward Florence Lake. Trying to drop more quickly, Pierce pulled the rip rope, but it broke without tearing open the balloon. He continued straight for the lake. Growing desperate, Pierce changed his strategy. Taking off his boots, he let them drop, sending his pistol and other possessions after them. If he could reduce his weight, he thought, maybe he could float past the lake to the other side. He was in the process of taking off his pants when he hit the water. The bee described what followed. It, the balloon, gave a sudden lurch forward and dragged him up out of the water for 15 feet. It then struck the water and dragged him along the surface. The cloth flapped and then filled with wind like a sail, making the water fly in every direction. He was approaching a clump of willows on the opposite shore and could see no opening except near the top of the trees, and a very small cover there in one place, just wide enough for the balloon to pass through. Sticking out his left leg, he guided the craft through this narrow place and thus reached the shore. He was then dragged through the mud, weeds, and bushes, steering along with his legs, arms, and shoulders, all the time trying to stop the thing, but it couldn't be stopped, as no gas was being exhausted and he could not get hold of the valve rope. At length a little lull in the wind came, and then catching the valve rope, he let the gas escape and began yelling for help, the balloon taking 10 or 15 lively jumps before he could get it under control. 2 men witnessed the landing, a pair of Winnebago Indians. According to the bee, they, quote, yelled, gesticulated, and danced about in the wildest manner imaginable. Surely the natives were astonished, reasoned the bee. More likely they were just doubled over with laughter. Recovering somewhat, the Winnebagos came to Pierce's rescue and helped him recover his battered balloon. And so it ended. Rosewater, declaring himself vindicated, blamed the repeated failures wholly on the local gas company, railing against the miserable quality of the gas it supplied him. The Herald, noting that the balloon had been the direct and immediate cause of much profanity, admitted that its flight was really a fine spectacle. Nevertheless, it added that, as a newspaper enterprise, the balloon business was something of a collapse. The Republican couldn't deny that the flight had happened, but it could belittle it, which it did under the headline, Recklessness, referring to Pierce as a harebrained, daredevil fellow laying in the netting. It called the flight a sickly attempt at an ascension. Which is about all you can say when your archenemy has gotten a crazy idea off the ground, and you haven't. And that's the first story that I will read to you. The second happens around the same time, and it's called The Bridge. And it's the story of the very first bridge across the Missouri River. And it has, I think, its own interesting tale. It begins in March 1868. Damn you, Smith, we will make grass grow in the streets of Omaha. The speaker, Sidney Dillon, a man thoroughly impressed with his own importance, stood shaking his fist in the face of his listener, Francis Smith. It was a schoolyard gesture with a twist. Rather than a schoolyard or a saloon, the scene was taking place in the posh New York City headquarters of the Union Pacific Railroad. Dillon's fist threatened not a brawl, but a business deal which could destroy Omaha's future. Smith replied bitterly that it will take a bigger man than you to carry out the threat, but he knew that Dillon wasn't bluffing. The reality of the threat and its potential consequences was the very thing which had brought Smith and his friends here in the first place. Just then another railroad executive appeared and diffused the situation by announcing, "We shall have another meeting of the directors tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So the railroad barons would reconsider the fate of Omaha. Now there was nothing to do but wait. By the summer of 1868, Union Pacific work crews were advancing rapidly across Wyoming, digging, blasting, grading, and laying track toward their eventual junction with the eastward advancing Central Pacific Line. Soon, everyone knew, the two railroads would meet and the long-dreamed-about transcontinental railroad would be a reality. Railroads would then reach from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean with only a single break. That break was the Missouri River, yet unbridged. Where would the bridge be built? Several possible locations had been surveyed, of which two appeared best, one in South Omaha, between Marcy and Mason Streets, and another at Child's Mill near Bellevue. The city which found itself at the end of the Great Bridge stood to benefit from the jobs, the travelers, the commerce, and the prestige that would come from being at this great junction of the Transcontinental Railroad. The less fortunate city would soon find itself relegated to backwater status at the end of a railroad spur line. Omaha had long had ample reason to believe that it would get the bridge. It was already the working eastern terminus of the Union Pacific Railroad. The railroad's depot and machine shops were there. The miles of track started from there. To build the bridge anywhere else was unthinkable, or so Omaha believed. Then came disturbing rumors from New York. Quickly, a delegation of prominent local men, Nebraska Governor Alvin Saunders, businessman Ezra Millard, Omaha Herald publisher Dr. George L. Miller, and a few others, traveled to New York to settle the issue face-to-face with the railroad executives. Such an impressive delegation had probably never before gone forth from this part of the country. These were powerful men who arrived in New York City, accustomed to having their own way, accustomed to the respect to which their social rank entitled them. And these impressive, powerful men spent the next several days cooling their heels in the anteroom of the Union Pacific Director's office, waiting patiently for someone to listen to them. Finally, after interminable delays, General Grenville Dodge, the railroad's chief engineer, came out and announced the board's decision. It was Bellevue. Francis Smith, a New Yorker who was siding with the Omaha delegation, protested that we have not had a square deal. We are entitled to a hearing. But just then, Sidney Dillon appeared, and you know the rest of the scene. Next day came the crucial meeting for which the Omaha delegation had been so patiently waiting. At stake was the fate of the largest city in the newest state of the Union. Omaha, which in 1860 could claim only 1,800 inhabitants, was on its way to 16,000 by 1870. Everyone knew that this boom was largely due to the Transcontinental Railroad. Without the railroad, the boom would surely go bust. The reader will recall that the main reason for Omaha's founding was to help Council Bluffs secure the Transcontinental Railroad. Back in the 1850s, the Council Bluffs men had felt that a prosperous city directly across the river from them would increase their odds of being located along the railroad's main line. Their money and influence had helped Omaha secure the territorial capital and defend the prize against rival towns. The ploy had worked, of course, all too well. By 1868, though it was no longer Nebraska's capital, Omaha had surpassed the Bluffs in size and influence. Despite President Lincoln's 1863 order locating the Union Pacific's eastern terminus in Council Bluffs, Omaha had gotten the offices, the transfer depot, and the machine shops. The railroad directors, preferring to locate west of the Missouri, had, to the consternation of Council Bluffs, lost Lincoln's order. Council Bluffs then had ample reason for feelings of jealousy and suspicion toward its daughter city. But for now, the two rivals had to stick together against a common enemy. The bridge must not go to Bellevue. Harkening back to the squabbles over the Nebraska territorial capital, the Omaha and Council Bluffs men brought out a familiar weapon: money. "Sound the loud timbrel," read Governor Saunders' telegraph message later that day. "Bridge located at Omaha." The delegation had agreed to give the railroad free of charge the necessary land and right-of-ways. To sweeten the deal, Omaha promised to pay the railroad $250,000. Council Bluffs pledged $200,000. Which may have been the whole point of the exercise. Some have suggested that the railroad directors, never intending to build at Child's Mill, merely used the threat to squeeze $500,000 out of Omaha and Council Bluffs. Either way, Omaha got the bridge, the railroad got the money, and everyone was happy. Except Bellevue. 1869. Of the innumerable engineering challenges facing the builders of the Union Pacific, none were more difficult than bridging the Missouri. Plenty of people said it couldn't be done. Even at low water, the Missouri's main channel was 750 feet across. During a flood, the river could spread 4 miles wide over the valley floor, and distance wasn't the worst of it. Uncontrolled by dams or levees, the swift current was both powerful and capricious. It was constantly eroding the soft banks and was prone to carving new channels for itself through previously dry ground. The river's bottom, meanwhile, was an unstable layer of mud, sand, and gravel, unsuitable for bridge piers. Bedrock lay anywhere from 10 to 45 feet beneath this submerged layer of goo. Still, a permanent bridge was needed. Each winter, a temporary wooden trestle bridge was built across the ice, but had to be removed before the spring floods. For the rest of the year, railroad cars stood lined up by the hundreds, filling every sidetrack, waiting their turn to be ferried across by the rickety steamboat H.C. Nutt. For the passengers, the delay was just one more hardship, along with fatigue, discomfort, and bad food. But for shippers, the delay was both infuriating and costly. Work commenced in 1869. Using a new technology known as the pneumatic system, cast iron piers were sunk down to bedrock, one cylindrical section at a time. When one of the 20,000-pound cylinders was in position, a cap was fitted over it and the air pumped out. Atmospheric pressure then drove it down into the earth. Compressed air was pumped in, driving the sand out through a valve. Then another cylinder was fitted on top of the first, and the process was repeated. Down and down each pier went, finally hitting bedrock. It really wasn't that simple. Often the cylinder would hit gravel or clay and would have to be excavated by hand. Inside the cylinder, a dark, compressed air whirled 8 feet in diameter. Men would dig, filling countless bags and buckets. Your car's tires, if properly inflated, hold air at a pressure of 35 pounds per square inch. The men inside the pier worked in an atmosphere of 45 pounds per square inch. It was not pleasant work. One early description of the project reported that the men say that after leaving work and getting to bed, they often felt as if their flesh was being raised from the bone. What was happening was decompression sickness, what divers today call the bends. Each time a man left the cylinder, the rapid decompression caused nitrogen bubbles to form in his blood and tissues. As a result, many of the workers endured temporary paralysis. At least one died. Not surprisingly, it was hard to recruit cylinder men. Even in 1869, men did not line up to work on a project which had to keep doctors and a hospital unit on site. The work stopped for months due to labor difficulties. Pronouncing the whole project impracticable, the superintendent quit. The chief engineer, apparently desiring laborers who were less contentious and more disposable, tried in vain to get Chinese workers. Despite the problems, the work went on. At last, after 3 years and more than $2.5 million spent, the bridge was completed in March 1873. The traveler regards it with an astonishment which would be increased did he know the difficulties overcome in its erection, an observer wrote. Bearing only a single railroad track sitting high above the water, the bridge's tall and narrow structure emphasized its half-mile length. At a distance, it looks like a fairy fabric, with its splendor columns and immense length, but it was well tested by a pressure of thousands of tons. In its time, 10 years before the Brooklyn Bridge redefined engineering greatness, The Missouri River Bridge was an iron wonder and was seen as an enduring and indestructible symbol of man's triumph over nature. August 25th, 1877, 3 a.m. Standing in the doorway of his little guardhouse, John Pearson watched the approaching storm. Above, in the black sky, clouds rumbled with thunder and flashed white-hot with lightning. Below, spread out on the valley floor, visible now and again in the flashing light, the city of Council Bluffs lay sleeping. Pearson was the night watchman at the east end of the Union Pacific Bridge. His job was to keep trespassers away. A walk across the bridge cost 50 cents. Usually it was a quiet job, just a man and his dog keeping watch up there beside the railroad track. The guardhouse, dwarfed by the massive iron truss beside it, stood atop and near the end of a steep-sided, 60-foot-tall earthen embankment. Here, earth ended and bridge began. A harsh wind came roaring out of the northwest. Soon bridge and guardhouse were enveloped in the storm. Wind whistled through the open framework, making the bridge sing with eerie vibrations. Hail, like hammer blows from 10,000 blacksmiths, rang furiously on the bridge's iron surfaces. Lightning struck again and again, running in streams of crackling pale fire along the girders and columns. And for all this, the bridge was stable and unharmed. Waiting for the storm to pass, Pearson and his dog huddled in the guardhouse. After about 10 or 15 minutes, the sky grew calm. He stepped outside. In the cool night air, he felt the wind shifting to the northeast. He was facing north, looking upstream, when he saw something moving out on the river. It was hard to make out. It was dark and very large and seemed to be coming downstream. He peered hard into the night's blackness. The thing was roaring like a locomotive, but was unrecognizable. He could see only a tall, dense blackness, balloon-shaped, but tapering at each end, moving quickly toward him. He turned to duck back into the guardhouse, but never made it. The strange blackness struck the bridge. Then everything happened at once, as though time had been compressed into a single moment. There was the sound, the explosion of thunder, the roar of swirling wind, the groaning of iron twisting and breaking, the crackling and buzzing of arcing electricity, the splintering of heavy wooden timbers, the snapping of wires, all mingled together into an indistinguishable cacophony. And there was the sight. A flash of blinding white light, the flickering glare of lightning along the bridge's frame, the bridge itself being lifted off its piers, soaring high into the air, burning as it went, the bridge then falling to earth, one section crumbling and breaking apart as it smashed into the riverbank, another section vanishing, swallowed whole by the river. John Pearson was alive, conscious, and lying on the riverbank. Had he really just seen the mighty bridge torn effortlessly from its piers? Had it really been smashed before him like a toy, or had he just imagined it? He says that at this moment the situation was appalling to him, a reporter wrote later. He could scarcely recognize whether he was dead or alive, and he had some idea that the end of the world had come. Whatever had struck the bridge was gone, roaring away to the southwest. Otherwise, the wind, lightning, and hail continued all about him. He tried to sit up, but could not move. He was lying amid wreckage from the bridge, trapped, with telegraph wires drawn across his neck. One of his legs hurt from being cut or at least badly bruised. Somewhere nearby, his dog howled in pain. One of its legs had been cut off. It had been no illusion. 2 of the bridge's 11 spans were gone. The easternmost 500 feet of bridge, weighing about 500 tons, had been swept away before Pearson's eyes. But how? Battered, soaked, and confused, and wired to the ground, John Pearson knew only a few things for sure. It was about 3:30 a.m. The bridge was out, and at 5:10 a.m., a passenger train was scheduled to depart Omaha's Union Station and cross that bridge. He had to find a way to stop it. Pearson struggled to free himself. According to one report, this required a precious half hour. Scrambling to the top of the embankment, he found a red lantern, lit it, and tried to signal the watchman on the other side of the bridge. He received no reply. His signal could not carry far through the stormy air. If a signal couldn't penetrate the storm, it stood to reason that neither could the eyesight of an engineer crossing the bridge. As a matter of policy, the trains always crossed the bridge slowly. Would that be enough? No one would be looking for damage from a thunderstorm, however severe. Would anyone in Omaha realize what bizarre accident had occurred on this side? Or would the gap be seen too late in some awful, helpless moment just before the engine rolled off the rails at Pier Number 9? A recent sounding, before the rain, had found 38 feet of water at the east end of the bridge, more than enough to swallow a trainload of cars, crew, baggage, and passengers. He would have to cross the river. Running to his home nearby, he roused one of his neighbors. "Start heading down the track," Pearson said, "and be ready to signal any train that might be coming from the east." With that, he returned to the river and found a skiff. Pushing out into the swollen current, he began rowing for the other side. The storm had not abated. With the wind fighting against him, current swift, the water choppy and white-capped, and the sky black and disorienting, Pearson made his way across the main channel. Though his little boat was nearly swept against the piers, he at last reached the large sandbar in the middle of the river. According to the Herald, the soggy bar was known to have patches of quicksand that could mire the unwary. Pearson made it across on foot, reaching the river's second channel. Having left the boat behind, he had to swim. "All aboard," called the conductor. The passengers of the 5:10 a.m. train climbed aboard and made themselves comfortable. It was half an hour before sunrise. Up ahead in the engine, the firemen stoked the furnaces and let the boilers build up steam. It was almost time. Then, unexpectedly, came the word to shut down. In the cars, the passengers were informed that they'd have to go back out into the rain and the darkness and return to their hotels. They'd be going nowhere today. This surprising order came from the dispatcher's office, where a soaked and battered John Pearson had just arrived. By 7 a.m., the word had spread throughout Omaha and Council Bluffs. Rain or no rain, people came out to see the bridge. Those who had witnessed the bridge's slow and laborious construction could hardly believe the wild stories that were circulating. It had to be seen to be believed. Residents from both cities gathered on opposite sides of the river, staring at the damaged bridge and at each other. Everyone was soaked to the skin. The damage astounded them. One bridge span lay in a shapeless mass beside the river, the strong wrought iron bars being bent into all conceivable shapes, and the cast iron pieces shattered. At Pier Number 9, where the bridge now ended, the rails of the mighty Transcontinental Railroad were twisted like wires, one broken and one dangling in the water. The force necessary to accomplish such destruction was inconceivable. Many thought that only lightning could have caused such damage. Others, understanding electricity a little better, disputed this. At last, words like cyclone, whirlwind, and waterspout were on everyone's lips. 3 days later, the Bee taught its readers what appears to have been a new word, a word so unfamiliar that the Bee wasn't even sure how to spell it. The Union Pacific Bridge blowout should have been called a tornado, it reported, spelling the word T-O-R and then in parentheses E, N-A-N-A-D-O. Thus introduced, Omaha began a relationship with the word tornado, which in time became intimate, though hardly loving. To the Omahans of 1913 and 1975, it got all too personal. The bridge was out of commission for several months, during which time ferries came back into use. For pedestrians, canoes and small boats were employed. The railroad even cobbled together a footbridge over the quagmire between the channels of the river. This jerry-built structure lasted about a day and a half before collapsing and pitching its travelers into the mud. The Bee couldn't resist. "Those commercial travelers who were dumped into the mud yesterday afternoon by the breaking down of the footbridge at the Union Pacific Bridge must have played Keno sometime during their lives, for they all made the same exclamation when they went down. It was, well, no matter, it was only an excited reference to the realms of his satanic majesty. Union Pacific's poor luck with bridges paid off in another respect. It helped keep the railroad terminus in Omaha. Earlier, the U.S. Supreme Court, citing Lincoln's 1863 order, had ordered the railroad to relocate its terminus in Council Bluffs. The railroad had been dragging its feet. Now, as Omahans saw it, the 4 iron columns that stand in the Missouri River are 4 exclamation points against the removal of the UP shops from Omaha. In other words, since the purpose of the UP facilities was to service the lines to the west, it was now clear that locating those facilities east of the river would have been a disaster. The Supreme Court decision was doomed. As the Bee boasted, "The Supreme Cyclops of the universe has reversed the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States, and the terminus of the Union Pacific is located in Omaha." Thus, the story draws to a close, happily. In one respect, however, we are left with some loose ends, an important question unresolved. Sure, the passenger train was stopped, the bridge was repaired, and the UP terminus was kept in Omaha. I can even add that Pearson was widely praised for his courage and presence of mind. Big deal. What you want to know, and what none of the papers bothered to report, is, what about the dog? Did Pearson's dog bleed to death from its amputated leg? Or was the dog tenacious like its master and survive? When Pearson was unable to stop long enough to attend to the dog's needs, did the dog try to follow its master across the river? What kind of dog was it? What was its name? Much as we may find Omaha's old-time journalism amusing, at times we have to mourn its neglect of the important details. We can, therefore, do no better than to imagine a train passing at twilight, crawling slowly eastward across the Missouri River Bridge, reaching at last a little embankment on the Iowa side and gliding past the little white guardhouse. Passengers, seeing through their windows a man and his 3-legged dog, smile and wave. The man nods and touches the brim of his hat. The dog wags its tail.